Hi there, thanks for joining. Acrylics are a great choice if you want to start painting because they're very versatile and user-friendly. And they come in tubes or in pots or jars. And most of the times, straight out of the tube or the jar, they are of exactly the right consistency to paint with. So you can add a little bit of water if you want to make the paint a little bit more fluid. Or you can add a little bit of medium to make the paint more fluid or more transparent. What makes acrylics so unique is that there are also other kinds of mediums and gels available. Effect gels and mediums. Mediums to make the paint thicker or to add some texture to the paint or effects like pearls. The paint is very versatile. You can paint very thick with a lot of paint on your brush. You can paint with little paint on your brush, then you get more of these dry kind of strokes. You can paint very transparent, so watercolor-like. As long as the paint is wet, you can adjust it on the canvas or on your palette. But acrylics dry water insoluble, so when dry you cannot adjust what you've painted this far. And the same goes for your palette. If the paint is dry, you cannot use it anymore. Here you see some dried paint. Acrylics dry a little bit like plastic, you see. And another very particular thing about acrylics is that they dry really fast. And it depends on all kinds of factors like the temperature, the humidity and how thick the paint is applied and that kind of things. But in general you can say that after 10 minutes to a quarter of an hour the paint is already dry to the touch, so that you cannot adjust it anymore. The biggest advantage of the fast drying time is that you can very quickly build your painting in layers. Most paintings are built in layers. Often the first layer is the sketch, and whether that's with pencil or paint, that doesn't matter. You can put a new layer on top of that. Often artists use that to make global color layers. And later on, in even more new layers, they add gradually more detail and color differences. And with acrylics that's very easy. You can very quickly paint on top of the previous layer. And also don't forget, it's very easy to correct your mistakes with acrylics. You just go over it again. No problem. Now the other technique, wet in wet, is more difficult with acrylics. Wet in wet is a technique where you alter the paint that you just put on the canvas with new paint. And most of the time that's used to create smooth transitions between two colors or tonal values. And with acrylics that's more difficult, and that's especially hard for painters that are experienced with using oils. Because with oil paints you can very easily paint wet in wet. So with acrylics you can certainly paint wet in wet, but that needs a little bit of planning beforehand. And I demonstrate that in a lot of my videos on this channel, but in short it's important to pre-mix some important colors on your palette. Because when you've pre-mixed some essential steps, you don't have to mix colors in between in the painting process, because that takes a lot of time, and meanwhile your paint will dry out on your canvas. And also there are other things that you can do to make the paint workable for a longer time. For instance, use a mist sprayer. One thing that makes acrylics very user-friendly is that you can clean your materials with water. So you don't need solvents. But again, this is only possible as long as the paints are still wet. So take care of your brushes. If you are painting with one brush and you want to lay it aside because you want to use another brush, in 10 minutes or sometimes even faster, the paint will dry in the bristles and your bristles will get very hard and you cannot clean it properly anymore. Now, of course, we need something to paint on, and that's another great thing of acrylics. You can paint on almost anything. You can paint on a traditional canvas. That's a wooden frame with cotton or linen stretched on it. But there are also other possibilities. You can paint on panels, a piece of wood that is prepared to paint on with acrylics or oils. But with acrylics you can also easily paint on paper. And yet another option is canvas board. That's a sturdy plate with canvas glued on top of it. And canvas provides for a very nice painting experience because the structure provides for a great tooth for your paint. And you have different kinds of canvases. You have linen and cotton and that kind of stuff. Separate video I've made about that already. Canvas, of course, can be quite expensive. And I know that a lot of beginners don't want to start painting because they're afraid they're wasting a precious canvas. First off, whenever you paint on a canvas and it doesn't work out the way you want it to be, with acrylics it's very easy. You can put a new layer of gesso on top of your painting. And gesso is a primer for acrylic paintings. You can put that on top of your painting as well, and then you can make a new painting on the previous used canvas. With oils that's a different story, but with acrylics you can do that. But there are of course also cheaper alternatives. So I briefly mentioned this canvas board is way cheaper than canvas, and it has another benefit. Here you see the same amount of canvas boards compared with the same amount of canvases. You see, you save a lot of space with canvas board. And then you just have that sturdy surface that's nice to paint on. But as well you have the benefit of the texture of a canvas, so that's very nice to paint on. Another alternative is painting on paper. Make sure that the paper isn't too lightweight, because when you have thin paper, the paper starts buckling enormously. And yeah, you have all kinds of papers that are especially made for acrylics. Some blocks are glued to all sides. After you finished your painting, you can cut it loose with a knife, so it won't start buckling. That's very nice. But in this case it's only glued to one side, but that's great as well. I then tear off a paper, I stick it to a plank, and the manufacturers almost always make sure that you can paint on it straight away. But there's a big but. You can paint on it straight away, but you get a far better painting experience if you prime the paper with gesso. That saves you a lot of acrylic paint, because when you paint on paper straight away with acrylics, it gets absorbed way too much and fast. On paper the acrylics will dry even faster than on a canvas, but when you prime it with a layer of gesso, you get a nicer painting experience, you get more mileage out of your paint. But as well, the feeling is way better. You have more control over where the paint goes. As well, when you work on canvas or on canvas board or on panel, it's recommended to use gesso to prime the canvas. Here is a new canvas, and it always says it's pre-primed with 3 layers of gesso. This is the original color of the canvas. And you see that it is pre-primed. It's all done very economical, of course. So I always recommend putting an extra layer of gesso on top of this yourself, because you can test it as well. If you leave a part that you don't pre-prime yourself with gesso and you do a part yourself, then you can see that it makes a very big difference. You get way more mileage out of your acrylics. And there's another thing as well. Sometimes there are greasy parts on the canvas from the factory or something. You get rid of those greasy parts as well. And gesso is cheap. It's way more cheaper than acrylic paint. And another thing that's a big advantage then when you pre-prime yourself is that you can give it a color or tone straight away. So here you see a gessoed canvas that I've done myself with an extra layer. It's the same canvas, but I've made it a kind of a grey color. And there are great benefits for working on a grey canvas or toned canvas. It's less blinding to the eye, because white is very blinding and it's easier to judge colors and tonal values. But you can find more on that in the video about toned grounds. Now then, of course, you need to buy colors. And what kind of colors do you need to buy? I've made an extensive video about that already, but I'll list them here shortly. It's my recommended limited palette, as we call it. With these colors you can mix every possible color that you encounter. Acrylics tend to dry darker than what you see in wet form. Now, in general, that's not a big problem, but it can become problematic when you take a small or a long break.
I really need some coffee now. Oh!
Eindelijk.
Quick!
When the paint has become dry and you want to continue painting and you want to mix exactly the right color that you see on your canvas, then the color on your palette in wet form looks right, but if you put it on the canvas it will dry darker, so you get a color difference. So you don't want to mix the same color that you see on your canvas again, but you want to mix again the color that you see on the photograph. So I tell this so that you know that this is really difficult. Nowadays you can also buy acrylics that don't have a color shift or who have less color shift, but these acrylics are very expensive. So then there you have it again, there's always a price tag. And I can quickly explain why this color shift occurs as well. Paint consists of a binder and of pigments. The pigments are the little color particles that give the paint the color, and these color particles have to be glued together, and that's what the binder does. And the binder in acrylics is a little bit of a milky color, as you can see. If it dries completely transparent. Milkiness disappears, so that's why they get a little bit darker. These color particles come from various sources. Some pigments are more opaque, so you cannot look through them. And some pigments are very transparent, so you can see through them. And because the binder of acrylics is transparent as well, then you get that colors behave differently. You can have colors that are very opaque, and you can have colors that are very transparent, and there are all kinds of variations in between. And I only quickly mention this because I want to inform you, because otherwise when you start painting you might think, hey, that's strange, this color covers and this color doesn't, maybe I'm doing something wrong. No, you're doing nothing wrong, it's completely normal, that's a characteristic of acrylics. The pigments all behave different. The palette is the thing that you put the paint on, and with acrylics it's important that the palette, of course, is non-absorbent. So most of the times you have glass palettes, plastic palettes, tear-off palettes that are sealed with plastic, and preferably use a flat palette because that makes color mixing way more easy. These kind of palettes, for instance, are more suited for other kinds of paints, watercolor and gouache. So the palette knife is another very handy tool. You can use it to mix colors easily. When you mix colors with your brush, all the paint disappears in the bristles, there's nothing more left anymore on your palette. And with a palette knife that's way more easier. Then all the paint is on the palette, and you can clean them very easily as well with a little bit of paper towel. A palette knife like this is more suited to scoop paint out of jars, for instance. And this is a kind of versatile palette knife because of this flat edge. With a palette knife like this you can easily mix paint on your palette. And of course some painters like to paint with palette knives as well, so that's also a possibility. I have to look in my notes because there's so much I want to tell. Hope it's not too boring. Oh yeah, of course you also need brushes. You have brushes in all kinds of shapes, variations, sizes. You only know what you like with some painting experience, so that's very hard in the beginning. You don't know what you like. First, I want you to jump into it and just start painting, and then after a while you can try out some new kind of brushes. So what do I recommend to start with? Some flat brushes in different sizes and some round brushes in different sizes. I cannot name sizes because it depends on which size you paint. For a bigger canvas you use bigger brushes, for small canvases or paper or that kind of stuff you use small brushes. And then some different sizes. And flat brushes often are useful for straight lines when you hold them perpendicular to your canvas. Also you can easily block in large shapes. And with round brushes you can easily vary the line thickness, and you can easily paint details and that kind of stuff. You have to eat a lot of yogurt so that you have these empty jars. So you put water in it to dilute the paint, maybe a little bit with water. But also mainly to clean your brushes, of course. Paper towels are also very handy to clean your brushes. So I have a small tip for you on the paper towel thing. I always clean very extensively with paper towel because we don't want to contaminate the water too much, of course. Most of the time I make the brush moist in the water, and then I use the paper towel to wipe off the excess paint. And I repeat that process a few times. I make the brush moist again, I clean again, I make it moist again, clean again, until hardly anything comes off. And then I rinse it in the water. But you might say, oh, that costs a lot of paper towel, and that is true because I have a special bin here full with used paper towels. The next day I can reuse it. So here you see acrylics that I've wiped off yesterday, but acrylics dry water insoluble, so now I can reuse it. So that's why I keep it in a separate bin. If you're painting a lot, an easel literally takes the load off your shoulders, because it has a few benefits. First thing is you look at your artwork at a perpendicular angle. That's very important. If I would put this painting on a table, then I would look with an angled look, and then you would see distortion, perspective distortion. When I show the painting this way, you see that it gets distorted in perspective. And that influences the way I paint. That's very strange. Maybe you've encountered that problem yourself already, but your brain adapts to what you see. So then you start painting in that angle, and then when you hold the painting straight for you, you see, oh, it looks ugly and the proportions aren't correct anymore. But with smaller pieces of art you can also paint on a table. That's not that big of a problem, but do mind your neck and that kind of stuff. So for smaller pieces of art I recommend a table easel. You can adjust the angle at which you see your piece of art and for a better posture. And then of course you have all kinds of different easels, but generally speaking you have studio easels, for at home, when you always paint at home at a certain spot. When you want to paint outside en plein air, then you can buy tripods easels or field easels. And there are also all kinds of easels that are very versatile, that you can turn in all kinds of directions as well. Now, another thing that you might wonder about, do I have to do something to protect my painting when it's finished? And with acrylics, it's quite easy. You don't necessarily have to do that. Acrylics are quite robust when they dry, so they are not easily damaged. So for instance, for personal use, when I paint things for myself that I don't want to sell, I never varnish my paintings because it's not necessary. They don't get damaged easily. But if you want to sell your paintings, then it's a little bit of a different story. Then it's better to be safe than sorry, I always think. So then I varnish my paintings. So then the painting is a little bit more protected. There's another good reason, by the way, that you can choose to varnish your paintings, and that is if you want to give it a uniform look. Because we've already talked about these pigments. Some pigments are more transparent and some are more opaque, but they have all other kinds of characteristics as well. Some pigments are more glossy, and other pigments are more matte. So sometimes when you hang your painting at the wall, you see that some colors are more shiny than other colors, and that can be irritating. So if you use varnish, then you give your painting a uniform look. And when varnishing, you can choose yourself if you want a glossy look, or a semi-glossy look, or a matte look, finished look. So that is a good reason to varnish as well. Now, last but not least, how to start painting. Now that we know all these things, it's very easy to start procrastinating, to just not start painting, because it is very scary. And you're not alone in that. A lot of people have this problem. And they watch all kinds of videos, and they know a lot about painting already from watching all these videos, but they never put a brush on the canvas. And that's a shame. It's the same with everything in life. You learn things, you fall, you get up again, and that's with painting, it's the same thing. You just have to jump into it, build experience, and try to enjoy that process. And there's a lot to learn when you start painting. There are a lot of new things that you encounter, so it is difficult. Just say to yourself, it's okay to make all kinds of mistakes and just to try, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. There's no problem, that's what it's all about. That way you build experience. Preferably make a lot of mistakes and things that you don't like, that's great. I prefer that way much than that you watch all kinds of videos and never do something. Then you haven't learned anything in your own experience. But for instance, a tip that I can give to get you started is not to look too long for a good subject, a perfect subject. There are no perfect subjects, everything can be a nice subject to paint, and it's also a very good practice to start with only black and white paint. And that may sound boring, but that is difficult enough already. It's just a tip and it only costs you black and white paint, so why not? Just try and paint and paint. And I will tell you this, a little secret, even most experienced painters still often start with only black and white. They often make an underpainting in black and white, and on top of that they start adding color. And that is because the hardest part of painting already is that differences in black and white, in light and dark, sorry. So, and also I hope with this channel that I can inspire you a little bit or help you a little bit with starting to paint. So I've also made some really beginners friendly tutorials. I have a wine glass, I have an ara, and I have a landscape with a barn. Very easy tutorials that you can follow along. And even if you don't like the subject, don't mind that, but there's enough that you can learn along the way. So I would say just give it a try, and then yeah, you see how you can build a painting and that you don't have to do everything right at once. I cannot do that myself as well. The painting process really is you start, you jump in, you make mistakes, you correct them, and that way you build your painting. So I hope that helps a little bit, and I hope you have fun painting. See you next time.